And so now we've come to really the featured portion of our program. We are going to be having a wonderful presentation from Mr. Tom Vander Ark, and I'd like to read a little bit about Tom before we bring him up. Tom Vander Ark is the author of Getting Smart, Smart Cities, and Smart Parents. He is CEO of Getting Smart, a learning design firm, and a partner at Learn Capital, an education venture fund. Tom advocates for innovations that customize and motivate learning and extend access. Previously, he served as the first executive director of education for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Tom served as a public school superintendent in Washington State and has extensive private sector experience. Tom is a board chair of Charter Board Partners, director for 4.0 Schools, Bloom Board, Digital Learning Institute, Ednovation, and Imagination Foundation, and serves on several other nonprofit boards. So if you'll all join me in offering a warm round of applause to our keynote speaker, Tom Vander Ark.
Y'all have a lot of really good schools. That was fun. As a result, I want to start with my origin story. It was 17 years ago. I was sitting in Rick Perry's office, and Governor Perry had just come in from a luncheon, and he sat down and he said, "Tom, I just met with all these businesses, and they want to know what we can do to better prepare our kids for this new economy." And I said, "Well, this is like off the top of my head, why don't we start 36 STEM schools?" He goes, "That's great, let's do it. My people will talk to your people." So like literally overnight, with Robert Scott, who is the commissioner, we drafted an initiative called the Texas High School Project. And fortunately, you had I think you had about 3 schools at the time. Robert and I had no idea where all these schools were going to come from. We called the Dell Foundation, which had just recently been formed, and about a week later launched the Texas High School project with $10 million from the state and $10 million from Dell and $10 million from the Gates Foundation. And Senator, you and your team really took advantage of that and I think opened about 15 schools as a result of that. I'll tell you now, 17 years later, I worked with over 400 nonprofit organizations around this country. Very few of them actually did what they said they wanted to do. You may be the only one that did a lot more than you said you could do. And I am so proud of you and everybody here for what you guys have accomplished. And where are our friends from Educate Texas? Thank you for being here. So the Texas High School Project grew up and became Educate Texas. It's an extraordinary organization. Harmony is now part of the biggest and best STEM network in any state in the country. There's nobody that comes close to having accomplished what you have in terms of creating a great STEM network. So that's how we got to know each other. You have continued to grow and prosper since. Later in my talk, I'm going to talk about the great work that you did with the Race to the Top funds. And so this organization really has taken great advantage of important grant opportunities. So that's the good news. The downside is that we're living through a world that we don't really understand. I'm an engineer by original training. I love studying systems. And I'll have to tell you, when I read the newspaper, when I watch the news, I don't understand the world. It reminds me of the period between World War I and World War II when people were scratching their head wondering what was happening. So I want to start with a poem from Lewis McNeice, who talked about that period of time. He said, "Each of us has known mutations of the mind where the world jumped and rivers gushed from what had seemed to pool. For every static world that you or I impose on the real one must crack at times, and new patterns from new disorders open like a rose." I want to focus on this idea that you and I impose sort of a static model on the world. It's our mental model. It's how we understand what's happening. I remember sitting in thermodynamics class and learning about systems, and these systems were guided by an immutable set of rules. And like science, we develop a set of mental models, a set of if-then statements that explain to us how the world works. And when we see things like the Dallas shooting, when we see Baton Rouge, when we see trouble around the world in Paris, in Istanbul, in Syria, our mental model cracks because it doesn't seem to work anymore. And so today in this session and in the later one, we're going to talk both about mental models and our dispositions, our mindsets. Those two things sit on top of our knowledge and skill. And so developing knowledge and skill is really important, but the reason that you're so successful, the reason that you're so important as a network is that you don't just teach kids knowledge and skills, you give them a disposition and a set of mental models that help them understand the world. That's why I'm so excited about your personalized and project-based learning. We'll talk more about that. Let's start by talking about kids these days. This is one way that the world is really, really different. With my youngest daughter, we have spent the last year cataloging the story of young people that are charting their own course to a career they love. We've posted over 100 blogs in this Generation Do-It-Yourself series, and I want to quickly introduce you to 4 of those people that I think are illustrative. First, John Merrill. He went to Washington State, graduated a few years after my older daughter, then went to culinary school. He was smart about getting work experience. He worked in 4 different restaurants and then had the chance to open his own restaurant as the head chef. He did it for 2 years, but something was itching at John, and so he sold everything. He quit, and he and his wife packed up, and they, for the last 3 years, have been traveling the world, filming a web series on cooking and travel. So an amazing sense of adventure for a kid who, 6 years out of school seemed to have accomplished everything that he wanted to accomplish. Andrea Price was an AmeriCorps volunteer. She worked in the Delta in Arkansas. She saw a lot of kids that didn't have a very good level of nutrition or fitness, so she started a fitness company. Then she started a campaign to end hunger and to promote good eating. She went back to school at the Clinton School. She grabbed a degree there. Then she did some business consulting in Belize. At least that's what she told the IRS she was doing. And then she joined the Arkansas Community Foundation, and then recently launched the Giving Net, a nonprofit to promote wellness. So 10 years out of school, she's had a series of adventures, and she really sees herself as an evolving public servant. Andrea Ween was a journalist, and she contributed to 12 different publications. She had about 10 different jobs over the course of 10 years, and then decided she really had to follow her passion and wrote a book and started an organization called Gap to Great to help families recognize the importance of a great gap year. And then finally, Omar. Omar grew up in Switzerland. He went to an IB school there. He studied both law and business. He was convinced after flirting with particle physics that he wanted to be a human rights lawyer. And then he and his brother launched what's become Goodwall to help match high school kids with the best possible post-secondary experience. So when I look at young people like that, these are not average young people, obviously, but I think they're illustrative of what's happening. So what kinds of things did you see in common between these young people? What's that? Risk takers. Yeah, they are risk takers, right? One thing that I noticed is a lot of movement, right? These kids are changing jobs, if not careers, every year or two. They're driven by I used to say passion, but it's less than that. It's really just curiosity. It's often a tap on the shoulder that won't go away, and that may develop into a passion. They're all impact focused. These are young people that really want to make a difference in the world, and they're quite entrepreneurial. As you said, they're risk takers. And you've noticed they have gone in and out of organizations. They work for other people, then they freelanced, and then they started in organizations. I think we're going to see a lot more young people that live like this. And so, first point is, are you preparing, is your school preparing young people for this kind of a work environment? I call it a project-based world, where your career is really increasingly a sequence of projects. All right, second section, what the heck is going on? What the heck is happening? Think back to when you were in college. For me, it was 40 years ago. It was back in the 70s. For some of you, it was just a couple years ago. But even in the last few years, the world has changed a lot. Let's think about ways that the world has changed. This is the communications director for the KnowledgeWorks Foundation. She learned to thumb with two phones, with two different phones and two thumbs working in the White House. So she's connected, and we're all connected to an Internet of Things. I read yesterday there's 30 billion devices already connected. So we're increasingly living among devices that are connected, that are informing our lives. We're also living in a world that's contested. We've seen a lot of violence in our country and around the world that sometimes shakes our faith, that makes us doubt the amount of progress that we've made. We also live in a period where the media that we receive is often filtered in a way that suits our mental model. And so I receive media that's different than yours because I choose to channel my information in a way that aligns with my beliefs. That's made our politics more polarized than ever. We live in a world that's increasingly complex, and many of you have a science background and you recognize this, but we have built very complicated human systems that are interacting in ways that we did not predict. So the engineers that built Fukushima may have predicted an earthquake, but they didn't predict an earthquake and a tsunami. I'm also a finance professional, and those of us that wrote the algorithms that are now colliding in super trading machines never predicted a flash crash where the market could dip almost unexpectedly and instantaneously. David Dunn was talking about the plunge in oil prices from the middle of 2014 to the end of 2015. Oil dropped 75%. That was so far outside of anybody's forecast envelope. It left many of us, particularly those in the oil and gas business here in Houston, scratching their head. And then finally, global warming is another event where we're clearly changing the world that we live in. So we live in a complicated world. We live in a world where new forms of contribution are being valued. Non-conformity, creativity, design thinking. These are valued in new ways. When I left school, it was knowledge and skill, and the ability to regurgitate those. And today, Google's much better at regurgitating information than I am. What's valued is the ability to be creative, to attack real problems. The world's more competitive than ever. The good news is that it's really easy to create powerful apps, and in a matter of weeks launch an app that goes global. But it's also really easy for kids in Bangalore to do the same thing. And so while it's never been easier to form a business, to create an impact, it's also much, much more competitive. This company was formed with great fanfare, and it doesn't exist anymore. So to recap, contested, complex, competitive, and a world where we value different forms of contribution. I want to highlight a few schools that I think are doing a really good job addressing that. There are schools that are helping kids communicate. I love Palo Alto High School, where most of the students participate in a great journalism program. So they're developing public products, teaching kids to communicate critically. At many of your schools, you engage in collaborative, team-based, project-based learning. And the last one is an academic mindset, the ability to crank, to work hard. Some people have called that the new secret weapon in our economy. So that's a traditional formulation. The Partnership for 21st Century Skills used those C's now for 15 years, but the events of the last few weeks are making me scratch my head going, that seemed like we had a pretty good understanding of what was happening, and now I'm not so sure. I watched the Republican convention and the week before the UK vote to exit the EU, and so just in this year, where I thought coming into this year that our world was divided left and right, I now see a different set of polls. Polls are now inside and outside. People that believe they're part of a global economy and people that feel left behind by the global economy. There's actually a lot more in common between Trump and Sanders voters than there are between the parties. So we live in this interesting new world. Janet Yellen is there because we now, in a number of countries in Europe, have negative interest rates, something that as a finance guy, I couldn't have even imagined 2 years ago, right? So for all these reasons, it strikes me that we're living in a very different place. And so I want to quickly cover 4 trends. These are things that I think you ought to be talking with your kids about. I think each of these are really good subjects for projects. The first one is artificial intelligence. So we're living in an age of exponential technology. Here's the problem. We have a linear brain. And so when we think about the future, we think about that red line. So we think back 10 years, and then we assume that there'll be about as much change in the next 10 years as there were in the last 10 years. The problem is that we're on an exponential curve, not a linear curve. So the world is changing much, much more quickly than we anticipate. And so our forecast really needs to be on that green line, not that red line. So my question is, are you talking to your kids about exponential technology and what it means? The most profound of those exponential technologies, I think, is artificial intelligence and machine learning. This is changing every form of human endeavor. The interesting thing that's happened in the last 3 years is that while higher education is still very siloed, with departments that don't talk to each other, they're all talking to the machine learning scientist. Because if you're doing research in any subject, from political science to genetics to engineering, you're running machine learning algorithms against giant data sets. So everybody on campus is talking to the AI professionals. The interesting thing is that when surveyed, there's a big distribution about how rapidly this is going to happen, but the majority of computer scientists believe that that will go from narrow AI, where a machine-taught algorithm can beat the best Go player in the world, which happened a few weeks ago, to broad AI, where it's as smart as we are across many different dimensions. Many people think that'll happen in the 2030s when my granddaughter's in high school. Do I get a cheap round of applause for a very cute kid? So, but think about this for your elementary educators, that in 15 years or less, the profound number of questions that we'll have to deal with when machines are smarter than we are. And the question that we need to help our young people answer is that going to be good or bad? And what are we going to do about it? So who are the people that are going to be answering these questions? It's the people that are in your schools today. She is pretty cute. Here's another mega trend that you ought to be talking to your kids about. So now the majority of the world's 7.3, 7.4 billion people live in mega cities. Most of them in 50 mega cities. Interestingly, half of those cities are clustered around plate boundaries. Not fully appreciated. I'm a geologist by original training, so just think about half the world clustering in mega cities and most of those cities around plate boundaries. So while we've had a candidate like Donald Trump arguing that we need a wall, I'm in El Paso all the time, and I don't know about you, but there is a wall. I'm not sure what else he wants, but he's arguing for erecting barriers when exactly the opposite should be happening. We're at a point in history where we should be connecting our great cities and our great civilizations with pipelines and with communication connections and with immigration facilities. So we ought to be connecting with each other, and it's these great cities and the commerce and connection between these great cities that's actually going to be much more important to the future than the artificial national boundaries that separate us. So megacities are a super important factor. When I started writing the book Smart Cities, it was about learning ecosystems, but because I posted to the hashtag Smart Cities, I got to know this whole universe of scientists that are studying smart cities and how we can create cities that are more livable, more workable, more sustainable. So these, I think, are terrific questions to invite young people into. How do we make cities work for everybody? The third category you ought to be talking to your kids about is augmentation. There's many different kinds of augmentation. The simple augmentation might be the Fitbit that's around your wrist, just the biofeedback that you're getting from your wrist or from your phone. But there's also biopharmacology. A big question that your students are going to have to answer is how do they feel about gene editing, about genomic engineering? Now that we can, with powerful tools, recode DNA sequences, the question is, what are we going to do about that? Is that a good idea? Is it a bad idea? These ethical and scientific issues are colliding in ways that are completely outside our mental model. And so this is why interdisciplinary project-based learning is so important, because we cannot just teach our kids about the science. We have to say, here's what the science is telling us. When you combine that with the technology, it's colliding with our ethical and political systems. What do you think about that, right? It's our young people that are going to invent this future. We need to prepare them for it. And then last, we're living in a platform world. The three biggest companies on earth, Apple, Google, and Microsoft, are platform companies. If you go down and add Amazon and Facebook, 5 of the top 7 companies in the world are platform companies. So they're changing the way that we connect. They're changing our sense of economics. So just to recap, things that you might want to be talking to your kids about. Hypercities. I just visited Singapore. It's now the 3rd leading financial capital in the world. And it's happened over the last 15 years, an extraordinary place. So hyperdiversity and megacities, the rise of exponential technology, particularly machine learning, these new transaction platforms that are helping us rethink how we live and soon how we'll learn. And then the question of augmentation. I think these are 4 really important, confusing trends that would be great subjects for student projects. It reminds me of a Rilke poem. What we fight is so tiny, what fights with us is so great. We get really fixated on little stuff running a school, and the world that our kids are heading for, we just talked about the kind of stuff that they're going to deal with, the big stuff. All right, very quickly, I want to tell you why I'm here and why I love you guys so much. I hope it's valuable for you just to hear what makes you special, because there are very few other school networks in the world that do what I'm going to describe. So this is for your benefit to be reflective about what's great. So I love the fact that you're STEM, but not just STEM, interdisciplinary STEM. When I talked to these 3 scientists in Austin, what I loved was that they knew the science cold. They had a sense of a business opportunity created by the science. They had written a great report, and they were able to present it to a public audience. So that's a really rich learning experience. So I love the STEM focus, but I love the fact that it's so interdisciplinary. Perhaps most important is that you guys have a great culture in all of your schools. I just surveyed 20 experts, including Sonar, that have together opened 1,000 schools, and I said, what's the single most important variable in opening a good new school? And almost all of them said, get the culture right. And for all the Harmony schools that I have visited, it's a wonderful, rich culture. It's both supportive, but it's demanding. And I love the way you combine pressure and support, high expectations, but personalized relationships for all your kids. One of the ways that you use the Race to the Top grant is that your schools now, most of them are one-to-one. And so you've made really good use of the fact that device prices have plummeted, and so now you have a blended STEM model. I love the project-based learning, and I've told you a couple of reasons that I am so supportive of it, but you started as a STEM school, you became a blended school, and then you used that grant to introduce project-based learning. And while these things feel like different pedagogical strategies of personalized learning and project-based learning, the way you have combined those to create authentic and meaningful, challenging work for kids is really, really important. I think it's the best possible way that we can prepare kids for their future. Amazing projects. This is an old version of the El Paso solar car. You saw Sonar showed a better picture of the new one, but I love the projects that you guys create. I love the fact that kids are presenting. I love those infographics that your young people make. Here's something that's going to be really important for your future. You've historically had really good test scores in reading, writing, and math. What's going to be really important, not just for you, but for your kids, is to help them tell their story, to help them make a case for what they know and can do. So I'd love you guys to start thinking about portfolios where your students can capture those artifacts, where they can share them easily, and maybe where they can connect references, people that can vouch for the fact that they can do this kind of work. So thinking about artifacts in portfolios and a reference. And I'd love to see your kids graduate with a LinkedIn profile that has business connections that can vouch for the work experiences that they had and the kind of work that they do. So putting kids on stage, getting them used to presenting, and helping them capture artifacts of their own learning is going to be as important as a traditional transcript in the future. I love the making and coding that's happening on your campuses. I've watched bridges being broken. I love the way you're thinking in a comprehensive way about college and career readiness. That's not one thing that one counselor does, right? It's everything about your environment that creates college and career readiness, so I appreciate your comprehensive approach to that. I appreciate the way that your network has transitioned thoughtfully to this idea of teacher as facilitator, where you as often are are thinking about the best question that you could ask rather than the answer that you could give, right? That's an important part of inquiry-based learning and project-based learning. I love the way you're thinking about talent development, and often with local partners and also across this network. I love the way that you're thinking about real-time professional development, creating resources that are available for teachers. I love the fact that you have parents here today. I think you've had a lot of your campuses have worked really hard to develop great parent relationships. You guys do as good a job as any network in the country on creating active business partnerships. You know you have to do that if you want your kids to have work experiences, if you want them to have STEM mentors. You guys are really good at that. You create STEM or extra support and extended learning time for your kids. You're also trying to optimize the time that you have during your school day. I love the fact that most of your campuses participate in national STEM competitions like FIRST. I love the STEM partnerships that you create. This is here in Houston. I love the student ambassadors. When I have visited a Harmony school, I've had really articulate and passionate young people that have led me around the campus. And that's a nice thing to do for visitors. It's actually a great experience for them to practice being with adults, having an adult conversation, sharing what they know. I love the fact that your schools are so diverse and that is a great thing, that you make that a super positive thing. It's one of the things that I love about the city of Houston, the way Houston has embraced its immigrant culture, and I think you guys do that as well as any network in the country. I love all the recognition that we saw today and that you've received. As I said before, you're one of the few nonprofits that I've worked with that actually did more than they said that you were going to do. That's extraordinarily difficult, and you guys are making a huge difference at scale. And that's in large part because of the leadership, and not just Soner, but across this great network. So 20 things I love about you guys. Give yourselves a hand. All right, I want to close with a couple thoughts on leading in a project-based world. This is just a quick preview of the breakout sessions that I'll lead, and so you can join one of those if you're interested. But as I said in my opening, it feels increasingly like we're living in this project-based world where most people's careers are really less about who they work for at the time and more about the project or projects that they're working on. I reflected the other day that since leaving the X Prize Foundation 10 years ago, I haven't really had a job. What I've had is a series of projects, hundreds of projects, often 6 or 8 simultaneously. And I think that's the kind of world that most of our young people are headed for. And so in the breakouts, I want to talk about what does it mean to lead in that sort of environment. It's an environment of rapid change, and that's both good and bad, right? Your young people are going to leave your campus and go into a world where there's more opportunity to make money and to make a difference than there's ever been. For the enterprising, knowledgeable young person, it is an extraordinary period in human history. If you don't feel confident about your ability to apply knowledge and skills in that complex environment, you support Donald Trump, right? You feel like an outsider. You feel like the world is passing you by. You don't understand what's happening. And we're quickly moving into a world of people that are either connected to the global economy or feel left out by the global economy. And it's yielding a set of inequities that are really troubling, that we haven't fully dealt with. That's clearly a message from this last campaign season. So this question of, given that confusing, interesting, wonderful world that we live in. How should we lead? So the first question, the equity question, this is not just for school leaders but for communities, is how do we move people to the right? So if we think about the gig economy, on the left you have low skill, highly repetitive jobs. And as you move to the right, you have more freelance work. You have high skill, non-routine work. A lot of the jobs on the left are going to stick around, but they're not going to pay very well. So the question is, how do we move as many people to the right as possible? Ready to deploy knowledge and skills into complex, non-routine situations. And then how do we provide a living wage for people on the left? I think that's a question that we have to grapple with. That's at least a lesson for me in this political season. Secondly, I think we want to ask kids to take on big challenges. One really good example of that is the UN's global goals. If you look up #global goals, you'll find these 17 goals and then a set of curriculum resources behind each one. And I think these are really good examples of potential projects. So ending poverty, ending hunger, providing good health, providing quality education at scale, using technology at scale, smart cities. So that's a great source for really good project topics. So if you're framing a project and you have a kid that says, I don't know what to study, say #global goals, take a look. Moving to the right also means being a thoughtful leader. And I've been thinking a lot about this in the wake of violence in our cities and cities around the country. There's been a lot of talk of mindfulness, and Houston Superintendent Terry Greer became really interested in mindfulness in his tenure here. Mindfulness is being aware of yourself and your surroundings in the present. I think thoughtfulness is the next step, because it's mindfulness plus empathy. It's mindfulness plus consideration. And I think to be a thoughtful leader, we need to be both fully present, but we need to exercise empathy. Empathy with the person that's in front of us. Empathy with the Reuben that's in trouble, that's sitting right in front of you. Empathy with the neighborhood that you're serving. If you're a leader, you're called to exert empathy at scale. And so in the breakout session, I want to talk about what does it mean to be a thoughtful leader, to be both mindful and considerate. You guys have accomplished extraordinary things. You're one of the biggest and best school networks in this country. That's such a big deal that very few other people have figured out how to scale excellent schools. And so you are unique. You are special. You are important. You are a gift to your communities. You're a gift to your state. You're a gift to this country. And Dr. Taram, you've accomplished something really extraordinary, and we all appreciate it. So I want to close just with another poem from Rilke. And it's a reminder, this probably happened 20 years ago when you're grad students at A&M dreaming about what might be. We don't often enough lift our chin and think about what if. What might be possible? How could I actually change the world? And I love this poem because it was a very young man, about 80 years ago. He was 21. And with this openness and this authenticity, he said, I believe in all that has never yet been spoken. I want to free what waits within me so that what no one has dared wish for will spring forth without my contriving. I love that sense of openness, of authenticity, of God, just use me to be the difference. I don't know how, I don't know where, but I want to make a difference. And it's that sense of openness, of authenticity, this a bit of audacity, right? He goes on in this poem to apologize to God for being so audacious, to ask to be used as a vessel to make a difference. But that is my prayer for you, that together you can lift your chin and say, what if? How could we change just a little bit? How could we take a trend? How could we take the arc of history and bend it just a little bit more towards justice, towards mercy, more towards equity? That's what Harmony is all about. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
The first thing that I love about Harmony is the focus on STEM. But it's not just science, math, and engineering and technology, it's interdisciplinary STEM. So I appreciate that as a great focal point. I appreciate that when Harmony students take on a project that they're not just studying science, but they're looking at the history around that science, and that they're producing great reports and learning to speak publicly about it. So it's a real interdisciplinary approach to STEM education. I also appreciate what I appreciate about Harmony's approach is that you've developed a sophisticated approach to personalized learning in a blended setting. So students have a lot of individual skill building that happens in reading, writing, and mathematics, and that prepares them for project-based learning, taking on really interesting and challenging real-world projects, sometimes as a team, sometimes as an individual, but doing really interesting work, creating high-quality products, usually presenting that to a public audience, often building an infographic about it, making a PowerPoint about it, giving a speech about a topic. And so the combination of personalized learning that creates an on-ramp for a student that might not have very good preparation when they come to your school, and that gets them ready to do really interesting and challenging and motivating work. I think that's the best model of school that we've come up with. So our young people are graduating into a project-based world. We think 4 out of 10 will become freelancers working on their own. Another 40% will join organizations, but inside those organizations they'll manage their work as a sequence of projects. And so whether it's freelancing or joining an organization or going back and forth between those two, young people are going to step into a very fast-paced environment where their career is really a sequence of projects, where they have to do real-time learning to meet near-term objectives, where they're going to have to stay curious and connected to be really successful. And I think the best way to get kids ready for that environment is to simulate that environment in a project-based learning environment where they're both doing real-time skill building that gets them ready for integrated projects.